Story number 1.
The snow had fallen heavily in the days leading up to Christmas. Thick flakes, driven by a biting wind, blanketed everything in sight. What was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway to a secluded cabin had turned into something else entirely. My name is Claire, and I'd come to the remote mountain cabin to escape the pressures of my life back in the city. Work, relationships, all of it. I needed time to think, and the cabin in the middle of nowhere seemed like the perfect place. I arrived late on Friday, and the place was everything I expected. A small, rustic cabin, tucked away in the woods, its front porch barely visible under a deep layer of snow. The caretaker, an elderly man named Henry, had left the keys in a hidden spot, along with a note telling me that if I needed anything, I could call him. But with no cell service and the storm picking up, I knew help was a long way off. Still, the isolation was exactly what I wanted. Or so I thought. The first night was peaceful enough. The fireplace crackled as I poured a glass of wine, enjoying the warm glow of the flames. The storm outside was a distant rumble, the snow swirling in gusts against the windows. I read a book and eventually fell asleep on the couch, lulled by the sound of the storm and the warmth of the fire. But when I woke up in the middle of the night, I wasn't alone. I'd heard it at first, a soft sound, like someone moving across the floor. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again. A shuffle, followed by the faint creak of floorboards. The house was old, but these sounds weren't the usual groans of settling wood. This was someone walking. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dim, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. I listened intently, waiting for the noise to come again, and then, there it was, more distinct this time. The slow, deliberate shuffle of footsteps moving from the kitchen toward the living room. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and tried to dial Henry, but the signal was weak, and it didn't go through. I cursed under my breath. Whoever or whatever was in the cabin wasn't going to be easily scared off. I grabbed the fireplace poker and slowly rose from the couch, my body tense and trembling. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Maybe it was an animal that had gotten in through the back door. Or maybe I didn't know what else it could be. I slowly walked toward the kitchen, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The air grew colder as I approached, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep through the walls. The door to the kitchen was ajar, and as I peered around the corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The kitchen was empty, but on the far side, near the window, a shape moved in the shadows. At first, it was just a blur, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it more clearly. A figure standing still, facing the wall. It was tall, thin, and dressed in a long, dark coat, its features obscured by the dim light. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I could hear nothing else. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, completely still, as if it were waiting for something. I wanted to scream to run, but my legs felt frozen to the floor. I had to get out of there, but how? The only exit was through the kitchen, and the figure was blocking my way. I slowly backed up, my eyes never leaving the shape in the corner. It remained motionless, its presence suffocating. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. One moment, it was there, and the next, it was gone, as though it had never existed at all. I bolted for the door, yanking it open and rushing outside into the freezing night. The storm was howling, the snow biting at my face, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from the cabin, away from whatever was in there. I ran blindly through the snow, not looking back until I reached the road, where I collapsed, gasping for breath. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I been dreaming? Hallucinating? But the fear I felt was too real. It was too tangible. I could still feel the cold, the presence of the figure standing in the kitchen, watching me. I didn't know how long I'd been lying there in the snow, but eventually I forced myself to stand up. I knew I couldn't stay there, frozen on the side of the road. I had to get back to the cabin, get my things, and leave. The storm hadn't let up, and the snow was so deep that the road was barely visible. I made my way back, keeping my eyes on the ground, my heart still racing. When I reached the cabin, I hesitated, unsure if I should even go back inside. But I couldn't stay out here in the storm. I gathered my courage and stepped inside. The cabin was just as I'd left it. The fire had died down, the room quiet, the figure was gone. There were no signs of anything unusual. But the air was colder, much colder than it had been before. I could see my breath as I stood in the doorway, my hands trembling as I grabbed my bag. I turned to leave, but as I reached for the door, I heard it again, the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me. I froze, my body stiff with fear. The footsteps were getting closer, and I knew that whatever it wasn't going to let me go so easily. I spun around, but this time there was no figure. There was nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the crackling of the dying fire. I rushed out of the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My heart was in my throat, and I couldn't seem to shake the feeling that something was watching me. The storm was still raging as I made my way down the road, the snow now coming in thick sheets. I didn't know how long I had been walking, but I knew I couldn't go back to that cabin. As I passed the edge of the woods, I glanced back one last time, and that's when I saw it. Through the window of the cabin, the figure was standing again. This time, it was watching me. I ran the rest of the way to town, never looking back. Years later, I found out the history of the cabin. It had been built by a man named Robert Hawkins, who had mysteriously disappeared one winter, leaving his wife and child behind. The locals believed he had become lost in the storm and wandered into the woods, never to be seen again. But some said that he never left, that his spirit still roamed the cabin, waiting for someone to notice. I haven't been back to that cabin, and I never will. The snow, the storm, and the figure in the shadows, those memories are burned into my mind, and I don't think I'll ever escape them. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
The snow began to fall just after noon, heavy flakes swirling in the frigid wind as Lauren drove her old Subaru along the winding mountain road. The rental cabin was a last-minute idea, a place to retreat after a breakup that had left her raw and craving isolation. She'd picked it for its remoteness, deep in the woods, with no neighbors for miles, the perfect spot to clear her head. By the time she reached the cabin, the storm had escalated into a full blizzard. The car struggled up the final stretch of the narrow, snow-packed driveway before Lauren finally threw it into park, relieved to have made it. She grabbed her bag from the back seat and trudged through the deepening snow to the front door, her breath clouding the icy air. The cabin was rustic but charming, a small A-frame with a stone chimney nestled at the edge of a forest that loomed dark and silent beneath the snow. Inside, the air was cold but dry, and Lauren was thankful the caretaker had left a stack of wood by the fireplace. She wasted no time lighting a fire, the flames casting warm shadows across the room. The first night passed uneventfully. Lauren cooked a simple meal, sipped wine by the fire, and let the storm's muffled roar lull her into an uneasy sleep. But by the second day, the isolation began to creep in. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the snow was now so deep she couldn't see her car. The cabin's single window looked out onto the woods, the tall pines weighed down by the relentless snowfall. It was beautiful, but the silence was oppressive. That evening, as Lauren read by the fire, she thought she heard a faint sound above the wind, a soft, rhythmic tapping like someone knocking on the window. She froze, her book slipping from her hands as she strained to listen. The sound came again, distinct, deliberate. She stood, her heart pounding, and moved cautiously toward the window. The glass was frosted over, making it impossible to see outside. She wiped a patch clear with her sleeve and peered out, her breath fogging the pain. Nothing, just the woods, dark and impenetrable beyond the snow. Lauren laughed nervously, shaking her head. "It's just the wind," she muttered to herself. She returned to her book, but the unease lingered, and she found herself glancing at the window every few minutes. That night, she woke suddenly, her heart racing. For a moment she lay still, trying to figure out what had pulled her from sleep. Then she heard it, the tapping. It was louder now, more insistent. This time it wasn't coming from the window, but from the front door. Lauren sat up, her breath shallow. She stared at the door across the room, the firelight flickering on its rough wooden surface. The sound came again, 3 sharp knocks, followed by a silence that felt heavier than the storm outside. She slid out of bed, pulling on a thick sweater and grabbing the fire poker for comfort. Slowly, she approached the door, her socked feet silent on the floorboards. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No response. She reached the door and hesitated, her hand hovering over the lock. The snow outside was untouched. She'd seen it before going to bed. No one could have made it up here in this weather without leaving tracks. And yet, she unlocked the door and opened it, a crack. The icy wind tore through the gap, carrying flakes of snow into the cabin. She peered out, her eyes scanning the porch and the clearing beyond. Nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone. Shivering, she closed the door and locked it again. She returned to bed but barely slept, her ears straining for any sound beyond the howling wind. The third day brought more snow, burying the cabin in a blanket so thick it muffled every sound. The storm was unrelenting, and the power flickered sporadically, the lights dimming and humming as the wind screamed outside. Lauren tried to distract herself by reading, writing, anything to keep her mind from dwelling on the knocks. But as dusk fell, the oppressive silence of the woods seemed to press in on her, filling the cabin like a physical presence. The knocking came again that evening. This time it was louder, more frantic, and it came from the back door. The one she hadn't used since arriving. Lauren froze, the book in her lap sliding to the floor. The fire had burned low, leaving the room dim and filled with shifting shadows. She forced herself to her feet, clutching the fire poker as she crept toward the back door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. The knocking stopped. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stood there, staring at the door. She reached for the lock but hesitated, her hand trembling. What if someone was out there? What if something else was? The silence stretched, heavy and unnatural, until Lauren couldn't bear it any longer. She unlocked the door and yanked it open, her heart pounding in her ears. The porch was empty. The snow beyond it was pristine, undisturbed. But as she stepped back inside, something caught her eye, just beyond the tree line, a figure standing motionless in the shadows. It was pale and indistinct, almost blending with the snow, but its shape was unmistakable. A person, or the silhouette of one, standing perfectly still and staring in her direction. Lauren slammed the door, bolting it and pulling a chair in front of it for good measure. She backed away, her heart racing, as the fire sputtered behind her. She didn't sleep that night, her eyes fixed on the door as the storm raged outside. The next morning, the storm finally began to subside. The snow was blindingly bright in the sunlight, and the world outside the cabin seemed impossibly still. Lauren ventured onto the porch, her boots crunching in the fresh snow, and looked toward the woods. There were no footprints, no sign of the figure she'd seen the night before. Relieved but still shaken, she decided to leave. The cabin no longer felt safe, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. But as she dug out her car, she noticed something strange. On the roof of the cabin, just above the back door, were footprints, barefoot, leading across the roof and disappearing into the woods. Lauren didn't stop to think. She threw her bag into the car and drove as fast as the snow-packed road would allow, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. She didn't stop until she reached the nearest town, where she checked into a motel and refused to talk about what had happened. Years later, she heard that the cabin had been abandoned. The caretaker stopped maintaining it after a series of strange incidents drove away renters. Locals whispered about the woods being haunted, about figures seen in the snow and footsteps on the roof. Lauren never returned. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The snow began falling just before noon, soft flakes drifting lazily from a slate-gray sky. By early evening, it was coming down hard, and the winding road leading to the cabin was nearly impassable. Claire gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. The heater in her car was barely keeping up with the freezing air, and her headlights struggled to cut through the thick, swirling snow. She glanced at her phone, mounted on the dash, the GPS arrow stubbornly pointing forward. The cabin she'd rented for the weekend was only a few more miles ahead, tucked deep in the woods where she hoped to escape the relentless stress of her life in the city. But the storm was worse than predicted, and every instinct told her to turn around. Still, she pressed on. When she finally spotted the driveway, a narrow path barely visible beneath the fresh snow, relief washed over her. She turned in slowly, the tires of her small SUV slipping slightly as she crept toward the dark shape of the cabin. It was larger than she'd expected. its wooden frame looming against the snowy forest like a shadow. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, and a dim light glowed in the front window. Strange, Claire thought. The rental agency had assured her the cabin would be empty, the key waiting for her in the lockbox by the door. Maybe they'd left the lights on for her. She parked as close to the porch as she could and stepped out into the icy wind, her boots crunching through the snow. She grabbed her overnight bag and trudged up the stairs, her breath visible in the frigid air. The cabin door was solid oak, the lockbox hanging just to the side of it. She fumbled with the code, her fingers stiff from the cold, and retrieved the key. When she pushed the door open, she was greeted by a gust of warm air and the unmistakable scent of burning wood. The fire was already lit. "Hello?" she called out, stepping inside. Her voice echoed in the high ceiling space, bouncing off the wooden beams. The interior was cozy, just as the photos had shown. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room. A small kitchen nestled into the corner, and a staircase led to a loft bedroom above. There was no answer. The place was empty, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She told herself it was just the storm playing tricks on her mind. Maybe the cleaning crew had been running late and left the fire going before they left. She closed the door behind her and set her bag down by the couch. The fire crackled warmly, casting flickering light across the room. The storm howled outside, the wind rattling the windows and making the cabin feel smaller, more isolated. Claire settled in, unpacking her things and making herself a quick dinner in the small kitchen. She tried to shake off her unease, but something about the place felt off. It was too quiet. Even with the storm outside, the silence inside the cabin was oppressive, like the building itself was holding its breath. As the evening wore on, Claire found herself drawn to a small bookshelf tucked into the corner of the room. It was filled with old, weathered volumes, their spines cracked and faded. Among them was a leather-bound journal, its edges frayed with age. Curious, she pulled it out and flipped through the pages. The entries were written in a neat, cramped script, dated over 40 years ago. It appeared to be the journal of a man named Edward Marsh, who had lived in the cabin during the winter of 1982. His entries started innocuously enough, notes about hunting, the weather, and the solitude of the woods. But as Claire read on, the tone of the journal shifted. December 15th, 1982. Something isn't right. Last night I heard footsteps on the porch, but when I checked, no one was there. The snow was undisturbed. December 17th, 1982. I feel like I'm being watched. The woods are too quiet. Even the animals seem to have disappeared. December 20th, 1982. I saw her again, standing at the edge of the trees. A woman in a white dress, barefoot in the snow. She didn't move, didn't speak. When I called out, she vanished. Claire shivered, the words sending a chill down her spine. She closed the journal, suddenly feeling exposed. The fire had burned low, and the room seemed darker than before. The storm outside had intensified, the wind now a constant roar. She decided to head to bed, hoping sleep would ease her growing unease. The loft bedroom was simple but comfortable, with a large window overlooking the snowy woods. Claire crawled under the thick quilt, her body heavy with exhaustion. It wasn't long before she woke to a sound. A soft, rhythmic creaking, like wood bending under weight. She sat up, her heart pounding. The noise was coming from downstairs. Claire reached for her phone, but the screen was blank. No signal, no battery. She cursed under her breath, her pulse quickening. The creaking grew louder, accompanied by the faint sound of whispering. It was coming from the living room. Her first instinct was to lock the bedroom door, but there was no lock. She grabbed the small flashlight from her nightstand and crept down the stairs, her footsteps silent on the wooden steps. The living room was dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The creaking had stopped, but the whispering remained, faint and indistinct. "Hello?" Claire called out, her voice trembling. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the corner of the room, a shadow shifted. Claire froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The shadow moved again, detaching itself from the darkness. It was a woman, her figure barely discernible in the dim light. She wore a tattered white dress, her hair hanging in dark, wet strands over her face. "Who are you?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman didn't answer. She raised a hand, pointing toward the front door. Claire took a step back, her mind racing. She wanted to run, to get as far away from the cabin as possible, but the storm outside was relentless. She was trapped. The figure took a step forward, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Claire stumbled back, her flashlight flickering. The woman's face was obscured, but Claire could feel her gaze, cold and unrelenting. "Leave," the woman said, her voice a low hiss. "You don't belong here." The words sent a jolt of terror through Claire. She turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. She pressed her back against it, her breathing ragged. The whispering began again, louder this time, filling the room like a swarm of insects. Claire didn't sleep that night. She sat with her back against the door, clutching the flashlight until her fingers were numb. The whispers continued, rising and falling like a sinister chant. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed. The cabin was silent again, the oppressive air lifted. Claire wasted no time gathering her things and heading for the door. She didn't look back as she stepped out into the crisp morning air. The woods were peaceful, the snow glistening in the sunlight, but as she reached her car, she stopped, her blood running cold. There, in the snow just outside the cabin, were footprints, small, bare footprints leading from the woods to the front porch. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
The snow was relentless that January, a constant torrent of ice and wind that seemed to suck the life from the landscape. My name is Sarah, and I had been living in the small cabin for 2 days when it started. I was staying in the mountains to finish a writing project, a retreat I had convinced myself I needed. Isolated, quiet, and cut off from everything and everyone. The cabin was quaint, tucked away in a secluded part of the Adirondacks, far from any town or main road. The caretaker, an older man named John, had welcomed me on my arrival, giving me a quick rundown of the cabin. He told me it had been in his family for generations, passed down through the years like an heirloom. "Don't mind the quiet," he'd said, chuckling softly. "It's the mountains' way of talking." The first night was peaceful. I had unpacked, lit a fire in the hearth, and settled into a warm routine. The wind howled outside, but inside, the cabin felt like a little world of its own. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the old wood settling. It wasn't until the second day, when the storm worsened, that things started to feel off. By mid-afternoon, the snow was thick and the wind had picked up. I had spent the day working, my thoughts focused on the project, the words flowing easier in the silence. But just as dusk fell, I heard it, a light tapping on the window behind me. I froze, the hairs on my neck rising as I turned toward the sound. The window, covered in frost, was framed by the darkened woods outside. Nothing. I tried to brush it off, assuming it was the wind or maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But then the tapping came again, this time louder. I stood up, my heart pounding. The cabin was small, but I was unnerved by how still everything had become. The air felt thick, and I could taste the chill on my breath. I approached the window cautiously, peering through the frosted glass. There was no one there. No footprints, no movement in the snow outside, just the swirling wind. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. It was nothing. Probably just a branch. But then, later that night, after I had settled into bed, it happened again. 3 distinct knocks on the door. My pulse raced. I sat up quickly, straining to listen. The only sound in the cabin, the howling wind outside. I couldn't explain it. Who would be out here in this weather? I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept toward the door, peeking through the small peephole. Nothing. No one. The storm had turned the world outside into a white blur, but there was no sign of anyone approaching the cabin. I felt ridiculous, standing there with the door cracked open, peering into the void of the storm. But something didn't sit right. I bolted the door again, made sure every window was secure, and crawled back into bed, pulling the covers tight around me. The next day, the storm worsened. The snow had buried the cabin to the point where I couldn't even see my car anymore. I spent the day working on my writing again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every little sound made me jump. The wind outside seemed to carry whispers, distant and unclear. It was getting harder to concentrate, and I couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that something was wrong. Around sunset, I decided to go for a walk. I wasn't sure why, but the idea of stepping outside and breathing in the cold air seemed like it might shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. The snow was deep, reaching up past my ankles as I made my way out the front door, but the wind had slowed to a soft, eerie breeze. The woods around the cabin were quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling of animals, just the soft crunch of snow beneath my boots. As I walked farther into the trees, I noticed something strange. There were no footprints. I had come from the cabin, and I hadn't seen another soul in miles. Yet as I stood there in the clearing, looking around, it was as if the snow around me had been untouched for days. No tracks of any kind. The air felt heavier now, suffocating in a way I hadn't noticed before. I started to turn back, a sense of panic rising in my chest, when I heard a soft sound, faint, like someone calling my name. My heart skipped a beat and I whirled around, but there was no one. I felt my breath catch in my throat, and I quickened my pace back to the cabin, not looking back. When I reached the door, I rushed inside, slamming it behind me. The storm had picked up again, and the wind was howling as if it were alive. That night, the knocking came again. It was louder this time, and I could hear it coming from all sides. 3 distinct knocks at each window, and then at the door. I couldn't bring myself to move, too terrified to even breathe. I sat there in the dark, clutching my blanket, hoping that it would stop. But it didn't. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, but eventually, I must have fallen asleep. The next morning I woke to a feeling of dread that wouldn't leave me, and the storm was still raging outside. The air felt oppressive, and the silence in the cabin was so deep it made my skin crawl. That afternoon, I noticed something even more disturbing. As I stepped outside to shovel the snow around the cabin, I saw something in the woods. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, facing me. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person, still and unmoving. I squinted against the snow, but the figure didn't budge. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't waste another moment. I packed up my things, my hands shaking as I grabbed my bags. The snow had stopped falling for the moment, and the wind had calmed, but the woods felt suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the trees. When I left the cabin, I noticed something strange on the snow-covered porch. Footprints. Fresh ones. They were small, childlike in size, leading up to the door and stopping right where I had stood just minutes before. I didn't look back as I drove away, the sound of the tires crunching through the snow the only thing breaking the silence. The cabin disappeared behind me, swallowed by the trees and snow. I didn't return. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The snow had been falling steadily for hours, the world outside reduced to a blur of white. Ethan's headlights barely pierced through the thick snowstorm as he drove down the winding road that led to his family's cabin. He had been looking forward to this trip for months, a week in the mountains, away from the chaos of the city, a much-needed break from work, and a chance to reconnect with himself. But now, as the snow piled up on the sides of the road, the atmosphere felt off. The roads were empty, not a single car in sight, and the isolation of the area seemed to amplify the eerie quiet that surrounded him. He'd taken this trip before, countless times, but something felt different this year. A nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. He tried to shake it off. It was just the storm making everything feel ominous. Just his mind playing tricks. The cabin finally came into view, its silhouette dark against the storm. It was small, tucked away at the edge of the forest, with a thick layer of snow covering the roof and porch. The warm glow of light from the windows seemed like a welcome sight in the midst of the snowstorm. Ethan parked his car and grabbed his bag, already anticipating the warmth of the wood stove that would greet him inside. He was glad to be there. The storm meant he was going to be completely cut off from the outside world, and the thought of being alone, surrounded by nature, sounded perfect. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was just as he remembered, cozy, with wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen in the corner. A thick layer of dust covered the furniture, untouched since his last visit months ago. Ethan set his bag down and moved to light the fire, but as he did, his eyes landed on something odd, a small framed photograph on the mantel. He hadn't noticed it before. The picture showed the cabin in the background, a group of people standing in front, all dressed in old-fashioned winter clothing. Their faces were obscured by snow and shadows, but there was something unsettling about the photo. Ethan felt a sudden chill, and though he didn't know why, he quickly turned away from the photo and busied himself with the fire. The crackling of the wood soon filled the silence, and the warmth of the fire began to seep into his bones. But the unease never quite left him. Every time he glanced toward the photo on the mantel, it felt like there was someone watching him. He tried to focus on the comfort of the cabin, but that creeping feeling wouldn't go away. After a light dinner, Ethan decided to turn in early. The storm was still howling outside, the wind picking up, causing the cabin to creak and groan. He climbed into bed, pulling the heavy blankets up to his chin, and closed his eyes. But sleep wouldn't come. He tossed and turned, his mind racing. The wind outside seemed to grow louder, and each gust made the cabin shake. He could hear the whistling through the cracks in the walls, like a mournful voice calling out into the night. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the floorboards below. Ethan shot up in bed, heart pounding. It was nothing, he told himself. Probably just a branch falling from one of the trees outside, or the house settling. But then came another noise, this time softer, almost like footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps coming from the hallway. Ethan's blood ran cold. He hadn't heard anyone approach the cabin, and there was no one else here. The storm outside ensured that he was completely alone. The footsteps stopped just outside his bedroom door. Ethan held his breath, his heart thudding in his chest. The door was closed, and he could hear nothing but the sound of the wind. Then the handle turned. He leaped out of bed, grabbing a nearby chair and wedging it under the doorknob, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He backed away, eyes darting to the window, but all he could see was the swirling snow, the darkness beyond. The sound of footsteps resumed, this time in the hallway. They moved from room to room, lingering at each door before continuing down the stairs to the living room. Ethan pressed his back against the wall, barely daring to breathe, his mind racing for an explanation. He had to be hearing things. The storm was messing with his head. There was no way anyone could be in the cabin. No one had been near the place for months. The footsteps stopped again, but this time they were followed by a soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. The noise grew louder, closer, until it was right outside his door. Ethan's pulse was a drumbeat in his ears as he slowly reached for his phone. It was dead. No service. Panic surged through him. The noises outside the door were growing more erratic now, sharp, like fingernails dragging across the floorboards. He had to leave. He wasn't staying another second in this cabin. But as he moved toward the door, it opened. Ethan stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The door creaked slowly, then swung all the way open to reveal the hallway, empty and dark. The temperature in the room plummeted. He could see his breath in the air now, thick and frosty, swirling before his face. And then he heard it, the whisper. "Leave now." The voice was faint, but it was unmistakable. The voice of a woman, soft but insistent, and it came from just outside the door. Ethan's eyes darted toward the staircase, then toward the windows, but there was nowhere to go. He grabbed his jacket, shoving his arms into the sleeves, and ran toward the front door. But when he reached it, the door wouldn't open. It was stuck. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, filling the cabin. "You should have never come back." A chill ran through him as he turned toward the kitchen. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. A woman in an old-fashioned winter dress, her face obscured by a veil of long, dark hair. She stood motionless, staring at him, the faintest glimmer of something like recognition in her eyes. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The woman's presence was suffocating, and he could feel the weight of her stare pressing against him, pulling at him. Her lips parted, and the whisper grew louder. "Leave, before it's too late." The figure took a slow step forward, and the air around Ethan seemed to freeze, the warmth of the fire in the other room dissipating in an instant. He could feel the weight of the cabin's history pressing down on him, the stories of people who had vanished, of things left unsaid. With everything in him, Ethan forced himself to break free of the trance, to push past the fear that had rooted him to the spot. He turned and bolted for the back door, the snowstorm outside swirling around him as he escaped into the night. The wind howled in his ears, and his eyes watered from the cold, but he didn't stop. he ran. And as he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't running fast enough, that she was still watching him from the dark cabin behind him, waiting. Ethan didn't stop until he reached the nearest town, where he found a phone and called for help. But when he returned to the cabin with the authorities the next morning, there was no sign of the woman. No footprints in the snow, just a cold, empty house. As they searched the cabin, one of the officers found the old photograph on the mantel. The faces were clearer now. There, among the group of people, was the woman from the doorway, her pale, ghostly face staring back at them. She hadn't been in the photo before, not when Ethan first saw it. The officer turned to him, his face pale. "You're not the first to see her," he said quietly. "People have been disappearing up here for decades, and no one who ever comes to stay in that cabin ever leaves the same." Story the end.
Story number 6.
The snowstorm was relentless, thick, and unforgiving. Sarah gripped the steering wheel as she navigated the winding mountain roads. The visibility was almost non-existent, the world outside reduced to a blur of white. She had grown used to winter drives, but tonight felt different. The isolation of the mountain pass combined with the fierce storm made her nervous. Her phone had no signal and the GPS was useless. She had already driven far beyond the usual highway routes. The cabin she rented was supposed to be remote, perfect for a weekend of peace and solitude. The silence that had come with being so far from civilization was supposed to be therapeutic, away from the demands of her busy life. But as the hours wore on and the snow piled up, she began to regret her decision. The headlights finally revealed the silhouette of the cabin in the distance. It was small, nestled on the edge of a dense forest, and the lights in the windows shone warmly through the storm. Sarah's shoulders relaxed a little as she pulled up to the front of the cabin, grateful to have arrived at her destination. She gathered her things and stepped out into the frigid cold, her breath visible in the air as the wind howled around her. The snow was already up to her ankles, and she hurried to the door, eager to get inside and warm up. The key was under the mat, as promised, and she opened the door with a quiet creak. The interior was exactly what she'd imagined, rustic, cozy, with wooden beams overhead and a stone fireplace in the corner. There was a slight musty smell, as though the cabin had been empty for a while, but it wasn't unpleasant. A small table sat by the window where she could see the snow swirling outside, the forest dark and silent. She set her bag down, took off her coat, and started a fire in the fireplace, the crackling of the wood filling the silence. Once the fire was blazing, she took a deep breath and allowed herself to relax. She wasn't going to let the storm bother her. She was here to unwind, to get away from everything for a few days. The storm would pass, and tomorrow would be clear. But as she settled onto the couch with a hot cup of tea, she began to feel it. A strange tension in the air. The temperature seemed to drop in the room, even with the fire roaring in the hearth. Her skin tingled, and she felt an inexplicable sense of being watched. It wasn't the kind of feeling that made you jump out of your skin, more of a lingering discomfort, a quiet unease. She dismissed it, reminding herself that she was just tired from the long drive. She focused on the fire, hoping the warmth would wash away the strange feeling. But then, from the corner of the room, she heard it. A soft thud, as though something had fallen to the floor. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She froze, listening. Nothing else. The cabin was silent. She glanced around, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing unusual. Maybe it was just the house settling, she thought, trying to calm herself. Old buildings creaked and groaned, especially in the cold. She returned to her tea, but now every little sound seemed amplified. The wind howled outside, the snow battering against the windows. Then she heard it again, another thud, louder this time, coming from above. Her gaze shifted toward the ceiling. There was an upstairs, but it wasn't much more than an open loft space with a small bed. She hadn't noticed anything strange when she had toured the place earlier, but now she wasn't so sure. The silence that followed the noise was suffocating. She was aware of every creak, every groan of the house, the echo of the storm outside. She stood up, hesitated for a moment, then made her way toward the stairs, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. At the top of the stairs, the loft was dark. Only the light from the living room below filtered up, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. She felt a chill run down her spine as she took a cautious step forward. There, at the far end of the loft, was a door, half open. That door hadn't been open when she arrived. Her throat tightened. Something was wrong. She stepped closer, the darkness of the room swallowing up the light from below. The air was colder here, and her breath came out in small clouds. The door was cracked just wide enough for her to see the faint outline of a small bed. The door opened with a soft creak as she pushed it open, and she quickly scanned the room. Empty. Nothing unusual. The bed was neatly made, and a small window showed the relentless storm outside. But then her eyes caught something on the floor. A small, old-fashioned doll. It sat in the center of the room, its face worn and faded, its clothes tattered. The doll's eyes seemed to gleam in the dim light, and Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She couldn't explain it, but something about the doll disturbed her. It looked out of place in the otherwise neat room. She picked it up, shivering as the coldness of the porcelain chilled her fingers. A whisper of wind gusted through the window, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Suddenly, a loud bang came from downstairs, followed by a heavy scraping sound. Sarah jumped, dropping the doll back onto the floor. Her heart raced. She had to check it out. The staircase creaked under her weight as she descended quickly, her legs trembling. The room below was exactly as she had left it. Nothing had changed. The fire in the fireplace still crackled, sending shadows dancing along the walls. But something was wrong. The warmth from the fire didn't seem to reach her. The air was thick, oppressive, and the sense of being watched returned, stronger this time. She turned toward the kitchen, half expecting to see someone standing there, but it was empty. The scraping noise came again, this time from directly behind her. Spinning around, she froze. Standing in the doorway of the living room was a figure. A woman, dressed in an old-fashioned winter coat, her face obscured by a hood. Sarah couldn't make out any features, but there was something eerily familiar about her posture, the way she stood so still, so perfectly still in the doorway. The temperature dropped sharply, and Sarah felt a wave of icy dread wash over her. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and she couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her mind raced, but no words came. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but Sarah could feel the weight of its gaze on her, cold and unyielding. Suddenly, the figure's head turned slowly toward her, and in the deep shadows of the hood, Sarah could almost make out the faint outline of eyes staring back at her. A soft whisper filled the room. Leave. The word echoed in her mind, louder and louder until it felt like the walls were closing in on her. Sarah staggered backward, gasping for air. She turned and bolted for the door, her pulse hammering in her chest. The wind outside greeted her like a slap in the face as she rushed out into the storm. Her car was parked just a few yards away, and she sprinted toward it, not looking back. The snow whipped at her face, but she didn't care. She had to get out of there. She had to leave. With trembling hands, she got in the car and slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life, and she didn't look back as she drove away, the cabin disappearing into the storm behind her. The road was treacherous, but Sarah didn't care. The image of the figure in the doorway haunted her, the whisper still echoing in her ears. It wasn't until much later that she learned the cabin's history. The previous owner had been a woman who had mysteriously disappeared years ago, leaving only a small antique doll behind. She had been known to live alone in that remote cabin, and after her disappearance, no one ever dared to stay there again. Except for Sarah. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The snowstorm hit in the early hours of the morning, just as Rob and Claire reached the turnoff for the old mountain lodge they'd rented for the weekend. The weather had been forecasted to be clear, but now the road ahead was nothing but a blur of white. Claire glanced nervously at Rob, who was concentrating on the icy road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with every mile. The forecast had been wrong, and now they were hours from civilization, surrounded by nothing but trees and endless snow. "You sure the lodge is just up ahead?" Claire asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. Rob glanced at her, his face pale from the cold. "Yeah, it's just another mile or two. The road's not bad, just the storm's picking up faster than I thought." The tension in Claire's chest grew as they continued, the visibility becoming almost non-existent. They had rented the lodge to escape the stress of their busy lives, hoping to find peace in the mountains. But the storm seemed determined to strip that away. Her fingers clutched the seatbelt, a gnawing fear beginning to set in. Finally, they saw the outline of the lodge through the snow. It was a large, old house, nestled into the base of the mountain, with a long driveway leading up to it. The exterior looked worn, as though it hadn't been touched in years, but it still held an eerie charm. Rob parked the car in front of the porch, and they both hurried inside. The lodge was dimly lit, with an overwhelming smell of wood and dust in the air. There was a massive fireplace in the main room, though the fire had long since gone out. A quick glance around revealed a few chairs, a table, and an old rug, but nothing about the place seemed particularly welcoming. It felt abandoned, even though the heat worked and the place had clearly been prepared for guests. "Let's get the fire going," Rob said, his voice a little too loud in the otherwise silent house. Claire nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The place felt off. The air felt thick, as though something unseen lingered just outside their perception. She turned away from the fire and glanced down the hallway. It was dark, the shadows stretching long and deep. Something about the hallway unsettled her, but she couldn't explain why. "Rob, I'll be right back," Claire said, walking toward the hallway before he could answer. The hallway led to several rooms, each one covered in layers of dust. She pushed open the first door she came to and found a small library filled with old books, their pages yellowed with age. The room smelled musty, but there was a sense of familiarity about it. She stepped further into the room, letting her fingers run across the spines of the books. Most were forgotten histories and outdated novels, but there were a few that caught her attention. One, in particular, had a dark leather cover with gold lettering. Claire pulled it off the shelf, curiosity overtaking her. As she flipped through the pages, she found the book was filled with strange symbols and drawings. It looked like a journal, but she couldn't make sense of it. There was something off about it, though. She closed the book, intending to put it back on the shelf, but as she did, she heard a noise from behind her, a soft creak. Claire spun around, her heart racing. The air felt colder, as though the temperature had dropped suddenly, but there was no one there. No sound but the faint howling of the wind outside. Her nerves began to fray, but she chalked it up to the isolation. It was just the wind, the storm, and the strange atmosphere of the old house playing tricks on her mind. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. "Claire?" Rob's voice came from down the hall, breaking her thoughts. "Are you okay?" She turned and walked quickly back to the living room. "Yeah, just looking around," she said, forcing a smile. Rob didn't seem to notice her unease as he busied himself with the fire. The storm raged outside, and they both settled in for the night, the only light in the room coming from the flickering fire. Claire tried to relax, but the shadows seemed to move on their own, and the house creaked with every gust of wind. Around midnight, the wind outside began to howl louder, and a sudden noise made Claire sit up. It was a thudding sound, rhythmic, coming from somewhere upstairs. She looked at Rob, but he was already snoring lightly. Claire froze, listening. The thudding continued, each sound echoing through the silence. It was coming closer. She could hear footsteps now, faint but unmistakable. Her heart pounded in her chest. Who could be upstairs? They were the only ones here. Slowly, she got up from the couch and crept toward the staircase. The noise continued, slow, deliberate steps. "Hello?" she called out in a whisper, but there was no answer. The wind screamed outside, and the storm seemed to rage even harder. Claire's hand trembled as she reached for the railing of the stairs, and she hesitated for a long moment, staring up into the dark abyss of the second floor. Finally, her curiosity got the better of her. She took a deep breath and ascended the stairs slowly, each step creaking under her weight. The air was thick with cold, and her breath came in shallow bursts. At the top of the stairs, she was met with a long hallway. One door at the far end was ajar, and the faintest light shone from inside. The thudding was now louder, more distinct, like a heavy boot dragging across the floor. Claire stepped cautiously down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached the open door, her heart stopped. There, standing in the center of the room, was a figure, a man cloaked in shadows, staring directly at her with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but Claire could feel his gaze, sharp and unnerving, piercing through her. Suddenly, the figure vanished. It didn't move, it just faded into the shadows as though it had never been there at all. She backed away quickly, her hands trembling, and ran back down the stairs. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. Rob was still asleep, oblivious to the terror Claire had just experienced. She couldn't stay here another minute. The storm raged outside as she grabbed her things, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She tried to wake Rob, but he barely stirred. Panicked, Claire ran out into the blizzard, desperate to escape the cabin, the strange figure, and the feeling that the house was alive, watching her every move. She ran through the snow, the wind cutting through her clothing, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything but the need to escape. The only thing that mattered was getting away. Hours later, when the storm subsided, Claire was found in the snow, shivering and disoriented. She had lost track of time, but somehow she had made it to the road. A passing driver stopped, offering her a ride. She never spoke of what happened that night again, and she never returned to that lodge. Rob, though, did. He returned a few months later, searching for answers, but no one had seen or heard from him since. The lodge remained empty, its doors left open to the mountain, and the storm continued to rage on, waiting for the next lost soul. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The cabin sat nestled deep within the mountains, far from civilization, wrapped in an almost impenetrable veil of snow. Sarah had rented it for a much-needed solo retreat, a break from work, from the noise of her busy life, and the constant demands of the world. It seemed perfect, isolated, serene, a place where she could find peace and finish the novel she'd been struggling to write. She arrived just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the snow-covered landscape. The caretaker, an elderly woman named Eloise, had already left the key in a hidden spot as she had promised. There was no need for Eloise to stay, as the cabin was in good condition and there would be no visitors for miles. The first few hours felt like a dream. Sarah unpacked, made herself a warm cup of tea, and settled by the fireplace with her laptop. The snow outside, so thick and heavy, created a muffling effect, as if the world beyond the cabin simply didn't exist. She worked in peace, but as night deepened, she began to notice the silence in the cabin. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt welcoming. It was an oppressive quiet, one that seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Around midnight, Sarah began to hear it, the soft, irregular tapping on the front door. At first, she dismissed it. It was just the wind, she thought, or the house settling. But then the tapping came again, louder this time, almost insistent. Tap! 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 Her pulse quickened. She stood up and walked cautiously to the door, her feet making no noise on the wooden floors. She hesitated for a moment before pulling back the heavy curtains. There was no one in sight, only a swirling blanket of snow beneath the dim light of the porch. Frowning, Sarah turned away from the door, and that's when she heard it again. This time it was coming from inside the house, from upstairs. Her heart skipped a beat. The cabin was old, but it had always felt solid, nothing like this. The tapping seemed to move, following her as she stepped into the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. Each sound more deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to get her attention. Her mind raced. Was there someone in the house? A burglar, maybe? No, that couldn't be it. She was certain the door had been locked, and she would have noticed any footprints in the snow outside. She made her way to the staircase, her body trembling. There was a chill in the air now, a strange cold that crept through the walls. At the top of the stairs, the tapping stopped. The silence was absolute, and Sarah's breath seemed to freeze in her throat. She looked down the hallway toward the only room with the door ajar, the guest bedroom. A faint light flickered from within. She swallowed hard and stepped forward. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The room was empty, but the air felt different, charged, as though it were filled with some invisible presence. The light from the window illuminated a chair in the corner, its seat facing the wall. As Sarah stepped inside, her foot caught on something, a scrap of paper, old, yellowed, with scribbled writing. She bent down to pick it up, her heart racing. It was an old letter, dated back several years. The ink had bled in some places, but the message was clear. "Don't go to the attic. It's not what you think." Her fingers trembled as she read it, but before she could make sense of it, a cold gust of wind swept through the room. The window, still tightly shut, hadn't been opened, yet the curtains billowed as though caught in a storm. The room grew darker, the shadows thickening until they seemed to envelop her. "Who's there?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling. No response. But then, from behind her, she heard a voice. A whisper. So faint she wasn't sure if it was real. "Don't go up there." Her blood ran cold. She spun around, but the room was empty, the chair in the corner still facing the wall. The silence returned, only it wasn't peaceful anymore. The air felt wrong, thick with a sense of dread. She ran out of the room and down the stairs, her mind a blur of confusion and fear. She wasn't sure why, but her feet carried her to the attic door. The stairs creaked under her weight as she ascended to the narrow landing, the door looming in front of her. It was old and weathered, the paint peeling and chipped. There was something about it that seemed to beckon. But at the same time, she knew she shouldn't open it. Every instinct in her screamed to leave, to run as far as she could. But she couldn't. Her curiosity overwhelmed her, and with a deep breath, she turned the doorknob. The door swung open with a long, groaning sound, revealing the attic, dark, dusty, and filled with old furniture. A lone bulb swung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the room. There was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that should have set her on edge, but the air in the attic was thick, oppressive, like it was holding something in. Then she saw it. In the farthest corner of the room, against the wall, was a tall, dark figure. It stood motionless, its face obscured in the shadows, but its presence was unmistakable. The temperature dropped even further, and Sarah's breath clouded in front of her. She could feel the eyes on her, as though they were staring directly into her soul. She stepped back, but her foot hit something, a small wooden box. It was old, intricately carved, and it rolled toward her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached down to pick it up, opening the lid cautiously. Inside was a collection of old photographs, but some were black and white, others faded and yellowed with age. She picked one up, a picture of a family, smiling and standing in front of the cabin. They looked so normal, so happy. But there was something strange about the photo. The background was blurred, as though the picture had been taken at night, and behind the family, in the shadow of the trees, there was something else, something moving, something human, but not quite. Her skin crawled. She dropped the photograph back into the box and backed away, her heart racing. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't be in this cabin another minute. But when she turned to leave, she froze. The figure that had been in the corner was gone. Panic surged through her. She darted toward the stairs, her pulse hammering in her ears. She needed to get out. As she reached the door, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps following her, slow and deliberate, each step echoing through the attic. She ran down the stairs, not daring to look back, and bolted out the front door into the storm. The snow was blinding, the wind sharp as it cut through her coat, but she didn't care. She ran, stumbling over snowdrifts, desperate to get away. It wasn't until she reached the road, breathless and frozen, that she stopped. She looked back, expecting to see the cabin, its lights still shining faintly in the distance, but it was gone. The cabin, the shadows, the presence, they had all disappeared as though they had never been there. The snow fell heavily, but the storm no longer seemed menacing. It was just snow, drifting quietly down from the sky. Still, Sarah never returned to that cabin. She couldn't, and she never spoke of what happened to anyone. Years later, she would hear whispers in the town about the old cabin and the family who had disappeared one winter long ago. Some said they had left without a trace. Others said they never left at all. Story the end.
Story number 9.
I had always wanted to escape the city for a weekend. The noise, the crowds, the constant buzz of life, it was all becoming too much. So when a friend recommended a remote cabin in the mountains, I jumped at the chance. It was supposed to be the perfect winter getaway. Quiet, serene, just me and the wilderness. The caretaker, a woman named Ruth, had assured me everything would be ready for my arrival, and with a quick search of the area, I found no reason to hesitate. The cabin was located deep in the woods, far from any main roads. As I drove up the narrow, snow-covered trail, the world around me seemed to grow quieter with each mile. The snow began to fall lightly, then thicker, until it felt like I was enveloped by a heavy blanket of white. It was peaceful, almost otherworldly. I could feel the tension in my shoulders start to loosen. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked as picturesque as the brochure had promised. A charming log cabin with smoke curling from the chimney and snow gently falling all around. I was excited. Ruth had left the key under the mat as promised, and I let myself in, greeted by the warmth of a roaring fire already set in the stone hearth. The cabin smelled of pine and wood smoke, a scent I would soon come to associate with isolation. I unpacked quickly, making sure to grab my camera and take a few photos of the surroundings. The quiet was almost deafening. No cars, no planes, no sirens, just the soft, steady hiss of the snow and the crackle of the fire. That first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, read a book, and stared out the window at the dark woods that surrounded me. The snow had continued to fall, piling up in thick drifts, but I wasn't concerned. I felt safe, comfortable, alone. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling. It was subtle at first, just a sensation that something wasn't right. I dismissed it as nothing more than the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I had grown up in the city, surrounded by people and constant activity. The quiet of the cabin, so foreign, made me more susceptible to overthinking. The next morning, I woke to a world blanketed in white. The snow had continued to fall overnight, covering everything in a thick, pristine layer. I had planned to take a walk in the woods, but when I stepped outside, the air was biting, colder than I had expected. The wind howled through the trees, bending the branches, and I felt a chill run through me. Despite the cold, I decided to press on and ventured down a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. It was peaceful out there, for the most part. The snow muffled all sound, and the only noise was the crunch of my boots against the snow and the occasional creak of the trees in the wind. But then I heard something else. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me, but the sound grew louder. Footsteps. Someone was walking behind me, just out of view, following my trail. I spun around, my heart racing, but saw nothing. The forest was empty, the snow untouched behind me. I stood there for a moment, waiting, trying to listen for any sound that would confirm my fear, but there was only silence. Still, I felt uneasy, as though I wasn't alone. I decided to cut my walk short and return to the cabin. That afternoon, I tried to shake off the feeling. I made a pot of coffee and sat by the fire, watching the snow swirl outside the window. I couldn't ignore the sense of being watched, though. It was subtle, but it was there. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of something moving just beyond the window, but when I looked closer, nothing was there. That night, I tried to relax. The wind outside had picked up again, and the snowstorm raged on, making the cabin feel even more isolated. I locked all the doors and windows before settling down on the couch with a movie, but the sound of the wind, combined with the occasional creak of the house, kept me on edge. I brushed it off. Old houses make noises, especially in storms. Still, I couldn't help but feel like I was being drawn into the storm, as though it was closing in on me. Around midnight, I heard a noise from upstairs. It wasn't a loud noise, more like a soft shuffle, a slight scuffling sound. I stopped the movie and sat frozen, listening intently. The house was old, and it could have been the wind, but the noise was so clear, so deliberate. It came again, a shuffle, followed by a low thump like something heavy had dropped onto the floor. I didn't want to go up there. The thought of checking it out filled me with dread, but I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way up the stairs. The old wooden steps creaked underfoot, each one loud in the thick silence. When I reached the top, I stood still for a moment, listening. The house was silent again. I walked down the hall to the guest room, where I'd left my bags. The door was ajar, and when I pushed it open, I saw that the bed had been disturbed. The covers were in disarray, as if someone had been lying there. My heart pounded in my chest. I had made the bed earlier, before I'd gone out for my walk. The bed hadn't looked like that when I left. I quickly backed out of the room, feeling a chill run up my spine. There was no way someone had broken in. I had checked all the windows and locked the doors before bed. Still, the unsettling feeling of being watched lingered. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing noises, footsteps, shuffling, the low creak of the floorboards. It felt as though someone was walking around the house, just out of view. I kept the flashlight by my side, my fingers tight around it, ready to turn it on at the slightest sound. By morning, the storm had only gotten worse. The wind howled around the cabin, making the trees bend and sway. I stayed inside all day, not wanting to venture out into the storm again. As I sat by the fire, I kept hearing noises, scraping sounds like something dragging across the floor. I couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from, but they seemed to echo through the house. That night, I decided to leave. I didn't care how bad the storm was. I couldn't stay here any longer. The feeling of being watched, the noises in the night, the eerie presence I couldn't shake, it was too much. I packed my things quickly, not even bothering to check if the doors were locked. I just needed to get out. As I started the car and pulled out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood dark and silent, its windows staring back at me like empty eyes. The storm had worsened by the time I reached the main road, but I didn't care. I kept my foot on the gas, racing away from the cabin, from whatever had been haunting me. I never returned to that cabin. And I never asked Ruth about it again. Some things are better left unexplained. Story, the end.
Story number 10.
The storm came in like a wall of ice. By the time I reached the cabin, the roads were impassable, thick snow swirling around in vicious gusts. I had rented the place for a quiet retreat to escape the chaos of my life, work, family, and all the stress that had built up over the years. A weekend alone in the mountains seemed like the perfect way to unwind. The cabin was isolated, tucked away in a remote part of the woods where the nearest neighbor was miles away. The caretaker had given me the key a few days before and assured me that everything was in working order. It was an old structure, but it had been well maintained, he said. His only advice was to avoid venturing too far into the woods during the storm, which seemed like sound advice given the blizzard outside. I had arrived just as night fell. The cabin looked almost picturesque against the thick blanket of snow, with the smoke curling from the chimney into the night sky. The lights inside were warm and inviting. As I stepped inside, I could feel the relief of warmth seeping into my bones after the freezing wind outside. I took a deep breath, savoring the solitude. The first few hours were peaceful. I lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat on the plush couch, watching the snowstorm rage outside. It was beautiful in its own way, isolated, serene. I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in ages. For the first time in what seemed like forever, I could relax. But as midnight drew closer, I noticed something strange. I had been reading when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, barely perceptible over the howling wind outside, but it was there. A soft scratching noise, like something or someone was dragging itself across the floor. I paused, holding my breath, listening carefully. The noise stopped. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the old house settling. But then it came again, a slow, deliberate scratch. I stood up, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. The noise wasn't coming from the floor, though. It seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper in the cabin, above me, in the attic. I froze, my heart thudding loudly in my chest. The caretaker had mentioned the attic, but it was mostly for storage. I'd heard nothing unusual when I arrived, but now there was something up there. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced through all the logical explanations. An animal, the wind, something that could explain it away. But the longer I stood there, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A growing sense of dread crept over me, urging me to leave. But I couldn't just ignore it. I had to know what was making that noise. Grabbing the only thing I could think of, a fireplace poker, I made my way cautiously toward the stairs that led up to the attic. Each step creaked beneath my weight, the air growing colder as I ascended. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, the scratching had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I opened the door to the attic slowly, half expecting to find nothing. But as the door creaked open, I saw something in the far corner, a shadow that didn't belong. It was a figure, hunched over, almost crawling. At first, I thought it was just an illusion, a trick of the light. But as I stepped closer, my stomach dropped. It was a person, or at least it had been once. The figure was dressed in tattered clothes, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones. Its hair was long and matted, hanging in wild tangles around its face, which was turned downward. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt them on me. Cold, hollow eyes. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, my pulse racing. It didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. But I could feel it, its attention on me, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. A sickening feeling of dread washed over me, and without thinking, I turned and ran down the stairs, not stopping until I was back in the warmth of the living room. I closed the door to the attic and leaned against it, my heart pounding. What the hell had I seen? I tried to tell myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was tired from the drive and the stress. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. And that figure had been real. I sat by the fire, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The wind outside howled even louder now, and the cabin seemed to groan with every gust of wind. I could feel the walls pressing in, the air thick with something I couldn't explain. The silence between the wind and the crackling fire was deafening. Suddenly, I heard it again, the scratching. This time louder, as if something was trying to claw its way down the walls. My body froze in terror, and I instinctively grabbed the poker again. I crept toward the stairs, praying that I was imagining things. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard a voice, a soft whisper, just above a breath. "Help me." The voice was faint, weak, like a plea from the depths of the earth. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the attic or from the walls themselves, but it was unmistakable. My stomach twisted into knots, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I had to leave. I ran to the door, flung it open, and stepped out into the snow. The cold hit me like a slap to the face, but I didn't care. I ran, the crunch of snow beneath my boots barely audible over the roar of the storm. I didn't stop until I reached the road, panting and shaking uncontrollably. I don't know how long I stood there in the snow, my body trembling from more than just the cold. Eventually, I heard the sound of a car coming down the road. A few minutes later, a vehicle pulled up beside me, a local no doubt heading home after a long day. He took one look at me and seemed to recognize my panic. "What happened?" he asked, his voice full of concern. I can't go back," I said, my voice shaking. He glanced toward the cabin, then back at me. "You don't want to go back there?" he said quietly. "That place has a history, a dark one. People say it's haunted." I nodded, unable to speak. I knew that wasn't the end of it. Something had followed me, something that wouldn't let me go so easily. But for that night, I didn't care. I was safe, away from the terror that lurked in that cabin. Years have passed, but I still think about that cabin, especially during winter. The scratching, the whispers, the figure in the attic. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still feel its presence, lingering just at the edge of my awareness. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The road to the cabin was treacherous, winding through the dense, snow-covered woods. It was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful getaway, a weekend retreat in the mountains where Jason and Emily could escape the stresses of their busy lives. But the moment they turned off the main highway and began their ascent, the weather took a turn for the worse. The sky darkened, and snowflakes the size of coins began to fall, first lightly, then heavier and heavier, until the windshield wipers could barely keep up. Emily had her hands pressed against the cold glass, looking out at the blur of white that surrounded them. The storm was growing more intense by the minute, and there was no turning back now. "Are we almost there?" Emily asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Jason didn't respond immediately, his focus solely on navigating the slick, icy road. "Yeah, it's just up ahead," he said finally. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, the tires slipping on the ice with every turn. "We'll make it. It'll be fine." But Emily wasn't so sure. She could feel the isolation of the place creeping in, the endless expanse of snow, the towering trees that seemed to close in on them, the eerie silence that settled over everything. It was like they were entering another world, one that didn't want them there. When the cabin finally came into view, it was nothing like the charming, rustic place they had envisioned. The structure was old, weather-worn, and looked as though it had been abandoned for years. The snow-covered roof sagged in places, and the windows were dark, giving the place an unnerving, hollow feel. It stood alone, nestled in the heart of the forest, with no sign of life for miles. "Great," Emily muttered, her voice laced with skepticism. "This place looks different from the pictures." Jason shot her a reassuring smile. It's just old. The pictures are probably from when it was first built. It'll be fine. They got out of the car, and as Emily stepped into the snow, the cold bit at her skin, instantly sending a shiver down her spine. The storm was intensifying, and she felt a deep sense of unease settle in her chest. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just the weather and the isolation making her nervous. Jason unlocked the door, and they both entered the cabin. Inside, it was even worse. The air was stale, the furniture was old, and everything had a layer of dust on it, as if no one had been there in a long time. The dim lighting made the shadows dance across the walls, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was watching them. "Let's just get the fire going," Jason said, clearly not as affected by the place as Emily. "We'll warm up, and it'll be cozy." Emily nodded, though she still felt the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on her. She looked around, trying to find something that felt comforting, but everything felt wrong. The coldness of the air seemed to seep into her bones. After a few hours, the fire crackled in the hearth, and they sat on the couch, wrapped in blankets, trying to ignore the increasing storm outside. But the wind howled against the cabin, and it was difficult to focus on anything other than the sound of the blizzard pounding against the walls. Emily's mind kept wandering back to the strange, unsettling feeling she couldn't shake. Around midnight, when they were both starting to doze off, a noise from upstairs jolted Emily awake. It was a soft thud, like something heavy being dropped. Jason was still asleep, his face relaxed and oblivious to the sound. But Emily couldn't ignore it. The noise came again, this time louder, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, dragging across the floor. Her heart skipped a beat. Jason stirred next to her, groaning as he shifted in his sleep. Emily's breath came in short bursts, her eyes wide in the dim glow of the fire. The footsteps were coming closer, moving down the stairs. She slowly turned her head toward the staircase, where a shadow seemed to linger at the top, just out of view. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "Jason," she whispered, but her voice was thick with fear. She reached out, shaking him gently. "Jason, wake up!" Jason groggily opened his eyes and blinked, confused. "What is it?" he mumbled, still half asleep. "Did you hear that?" Emily's voice was trembling now. He sat up, his eyes scanning the room. "What are you talking about?" The footsteps stopped, and there was a moment of silence before Emily heard something else, something far worse, a soft, almost imperceptible whispering, like voices in the wind. It seemed to be coming from upstairs, from the direction of the bedrooms. Jason stood up and walked toward the staircase, clearly annoyed. "It's probably just the house settling. Everything creaks and groans when it's this cold." But Emily wasn't so sure. She watched him approach the stairs, her eyes wide with fear. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It was as if someone was speaking in a language she didn't understand, too low to make out the words, but chilling in its tone. "Jason," she whispered urgently, "don't go up there." But he didn't seem to hear her. He continued toward the staircase, and Emily's breath caught in her throat as he reached the bottom of the stairs. She could feel the temperature drop, a chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. The air around her grew thick, oppressive, and she could feel her chest tighten. "Jason, stop!" she cried out. But he was already halfway up the stairs, his movements slow, almost mechanical. The moment he reached the top, the whispering stopped, and a deep silence settled over the cabin. Emily stood frozen, unsure whether to follow him or flee. She knew something was terribly wrong, but fear rooted her to the spot. Seconds later, Jason's voice echoed down from the top of the stairs, barely above a whisper. "Emily, come up here. You have to see this." His voice sounded strange, distant, almost not quite right. Emily's heart raced. She didn't want to go up there, but something in his voice urged her on. She grabbed a flashlight from the table and hesitantly made her way up the stairs, the beam of light cutting through the darkness ahead of her. When she reached the top, she found Jason standing in the hallway, staring at a door at the end of the corridor. His eyes were wide, his pupils dilated as if he were in a trance. "Jason?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "What's going on?" Jason didn't respond. He was completely still, his body rigid as he gazed at the door, his expression frozen in a mix of confusion and terror. Emily stepped closer, her flashlight illuminating the door ahead of them. It was slightly ajar, and she could see the faint outline of something moving inside, just beyond the threshold. Then the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Emily screamed and stumbled back, but Jason didn't move. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the door, unblinking. "Jason, we need to leave," Emily begged, her voice breaking. But he didn't respond. He didn't even seem to hear her. With her heart in her throat, Emily grabbed his arm and yanked him away from the door. She ran down the stairs, pulling him behind her, and without a second thought, they fled the cabin and into the snow. The storm was at its peak, the wind cutting through their clothing as they stumbled through the deep snow, desperate to get to the car. But as they reached the driveway, Jason stopped, staring blankly at the forest around them. "We need to go back," he murmured, his voice distant, almost detached. Emily's chest tightened. "No, Jason, we need to get out of here." But he didn't move. He just stood there in the middle of the storm, lost to everything around him. It wasn't until hours later, when Emily was found by a passing car, that anyone realized Jason had never made it out of the snow. No one ever found him. The cabin remained abandoned, just as it had been for years before, waiting for the next victims to stumble across its path. Story the end.
Story number 12.
The snowstorm hit hard and fast, unexpected in its intensity. One moment, the sky had been overcast but calm, and the next, the world was a white blur. Rachel and Michael had been driving for hours, hoping to make it to their cabin in the woods before the storm intensified. They had been looking forward to a peaceful weekend away from the hustle of city life, but now, as the blizzard engulfed their car, they began to doubt their decision. "I don't know about this," Rachel said, her voice tinged with worry. "This is getting really bad." Michael glanced nervously at the road, which was becoming harder and harder to see. "We're almost there. Just a little farther." Rachel shivered, not just from the cold, but from a growing sense of unease. They had rented the cabin from an old friend of Michael's family, and though the price had been cheap, there was something about it that made her uncomfortable. It was isolated, surrounded by dense woods, with no neighbors for miles. She had been hesitant to come in the first place, but Michael had insisted. "We'll have the whole place to ourselves," he had said. "It'll be great." The wind howled louder, and snow swirled around the car in gusts. Rachel pulled her jacket tighter around herself, glancing nervously at the dark woods on either side of them. The trees seemed to bend under the weight of the snow, their branches creaking and groaning. As the headlights cast fleeting shadows across the road, she could have sworn she saw something moving between the trees. A figure, perhaps, though she couldn't be sure. Her mind had been playing tricks on her ever since the storm began. "Just a little farther," Michael repeated, though his voice didn't sound as certain as before. Finally, the headlights illuminated the silhouette of the cabin, a large, dark shape rising from the snow. Rachel breathed a sigh of relief as they pulled into the long, winding driveway. The cabin stood alone, nestled in the trees, looking abandoned. It was a 2-story house with a steep roof that was sagging slightly from the weight of the snow. There was no sign of life, no light in the windows. "This is it," Michael said, parking the car and cutting the engine. Rachel stared at the cabin, her stomach churning. She had expected the place to look a little rundown, but this was something else. The windows were dark, the door looked aged, and there was an unsettling quiet to the place. No animals, no sounds, just the cold, biting wind. "I don't know, Michael," she said. "This doesn't feel right." "Stop overthinking it," Michael said, getting out of the car. "It's just an old cabin. Let's get inside and warm up." Reluctantly, Rachel followed him to the front door. The snow was already building up on the ground, covering their boots as they trudged through it. The door creaked as Michael pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air was musty, and the warmth from the fireplace was barely enough to take the chill off the room. A single lamp in the corner flickered weakly, casting shadows across the old furniture. It felt like no one had been there in years. Rachel immediately felt a knot in her stomach. The place was too quiet. It was as if the house had a life of its own, a strange, oppressive presence that she couldn't shake. The walls, covered in faded wallpaper, seemed to close in around her. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet as they moved through the house. "I'll get a fire going," Michael said, dropping his bag by the couch. "Why don't you unpack?" Rachel nodded, but she couldn't focus on unpacking. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the trees outside, to the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, she would glance toward the window, half expecting to see something or someone staring back at her. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, it was eerily quiet, save for the crackling of the fire. It wasn't long before Rachel began to hear strange noises. At first, she thought it was the house settling, but the longer she listened, the more distinct the sounds became. There was something else in the house, something that didn't belong. It started with a soft creak, like footsteps on the floor above. Then there was a muffled sound, like something or someone scraping against the walls. Her heart began to race as she glanced up at the ceiling, her pulse quickening. Michael was in the living room, tending to the fire, oblivious to the sounds. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on her, like the house was holding its breath. Another creak, this time closer, coming from the staircase. Then a loud thud, followed by a dragging sound, as though something heavy was being dragged across the floor above. Rachel's blood ran cold. She was sure she wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was upstairs. Her mind raced. Was it a wild animal, a person, or something worse? She didn't know, but she knew she couldn't be alone in this house. "Michael," she called, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you hear that?" Michael didn't seem to hear her. He was focused on the fire, his back turned to her. Rachel hesitated for a moment, then stood up and walked cautiously toward the staircase. The sounds had stopped, but her senses were on high alert. She reached the foot of the stairs, her heart thudding in her chest, and slowly started to climb. Each step creaked beneath her weight, the old wood groaning as though protesting her presence. The dragging sound had stopped, but the house still felt alive, like it was waiting for something. When she reached the top, she paused at the landing, looking down the hallway. Everything was still. The hallway stretched out in front of her, dark and foreboding. She took a step forward, her breath shallow, and reached for the first door on her left. It was closed, but the door handle felt cold and stiff beneath her fingers as she turned it. Inside, the room was small and sparsely furnished. There was an old bed, a wooden dresser, and a rocking chair in the corner, but it was the window that caught her attention. The curtains were drawn shut, but she could see the faint outline of something moving outside the window. A shadow. Something just out of sight. Her stomach twisted, and she backed away from the window, her heart racing. There was something out there, something watching her. "Rachel?" Michael's voice called from downstairs, breaking her from her trance. "What are you doing up there?" Rachel's mind was spinning. She didn't know how to explain what she had seen, or thought she had seen, outside the window. But she couldn't stay in the room any longer. She turned quickly and hurried back down the stairs. "Everything okay?" Michael asked when she reached the bottom. I don't know," Rachel stammered. "I thought I saw something outside." "Outside?" Michael frowned, looking toward the window. "It's just the storm." Rachel nodded, but she didn't feel reassured. She kept her eyes on the window, but it was impossible to see through the thick snowfall. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow deeper. They spent the rest of the night by the fire, but neither of them could relax. Every creak of the house made Rachel jump, and every gust of wind outside sent a chill through her. Eventually, exhaustion overtook them, and they decided to go to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Rachel woke several times throughout the night, each time feeling more unsettled. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging across the floor, echoed in her ears, though when she opened her eyes, the room was empty. She lay there, wide awake, unable to shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. Finally, at around 3 a.m, she couldn't take it any longer. She had to leave. She quietly slid out of bed, trying not to wake Michael, and grabbed her coat. As she opened the door, she heard it again, the dragging sound, this time coming from just down the hall. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The air felt thick, suffocating, and she could hear faint whispering, too soft to make out, but unmistakable in its urgency. The whispers grew louder, and Rachel's fear turned to panic. She bolted down the stairs, grabbed her keys, and ran outside into the storm. She didn't look back. She didn't stop to check if Michael was following her. As she sped down the road, the snow falling heavily around her, she could still hear the whispering in her mind. The cabin remained empty, its windows dark, the door left ajar, and the snow continuing to fall around it, as if it was waiting for someone else to return. Story: the end.